Okay, conservation of biodiversity, subtopic 3.4. So first you might ask, why conserve biodiversity? So we'll look at some values. Obviously we get a lot of direct value from nature, like taking food from plants and animals. And then having increased biodiversity can help increase the resilience of those food sources as well. Right now there's the issue with bananas being a clonal species, so they're kind of susceptible to this fungus because there's not a lot of diversity. We get a lot of other natural products too. A lot of our medicines come from nature, fertilizers, things like rubber. Gum actually comes from gum trees a lot of the time. Rope and cotton and silk, etc. Lots of direct values from nature, but also some indirect values. A lot of these are viewed as ecosystem services, whereas these direct values we think of more as ecosystem goods, things that we take, services we don't necessarily take but still help our environment. That might be cycling of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. It could be increase in soil health. Pollination helps us grow crops, right? A lot of wild insects are actually help pollinating our species. Nature can provide flood and erosion control as well as climate regulation. In fact, some ecosystems make their own climates as well. And then biodiversity, more biodiversity will just increase resilience in all of these ecosystems. So if you lose one piece, hopefully there's other pieces to take its place. Some other indirect values include like educational value, the genetic diversity of gene pools. There's also like ecotourism, like intrinsic value, just enjoying nature. And then also the rights of people that have used and lived in these lands for thousands of years. So a little distinction here between conservation and preservation. If you look at the image, the kind of really big thing that pops out is that red X over the person. So really the difference is whether or not humans are going to be involved in the environment or if we're trying to keep humans sort of separate from the environment. So conservationists recognize that it's really difficult to take humans out of the equation. So they'll try to kind of make a balance. They'll emphasize education and ecotourism and kind of have a more anthropocentric viewpoint. Focusing on how can we use this stuff sustainably, whereas a preservationist would be trying to make areas where humans are not included in natural systems, like just keeping them separate and on their own. Extreme ecocentrists are preservationists. Pretty difficult, and you might argue that it might be totally unreasonable in this day and age. So the main approaches to conservation are sort of split into two categories. Species-based, what's called ex situ, and habitat-based, which is called in situ conservation. If you take anthropology, you might hear about in situ and ex situ in relation to artifacts. So when you find a piece of pottery, you want to leave it where it is because then it's in situ, in place, and so you know about all of the rest of the context. If you take that pottery away from where you found it, it is now ex situ, and you lose all the context of that place. So the same kind of thing with these terms. In situ conservation is in place conservation. We're trying to protect the species where they are in their habitats. Versus ex situ is out of place conservation, so we take them away from their place to try to restore them at a species-based level. Ideally, you want to do a mixture of both, right? You can raise an animal in the zoos, but you need to have them back in the wild. And you might have a lot of habitat, but if the animals aren't reproducing, then it's not going to be really helpful. So a few examples of species-based conservation include CITES, which we've looked at extensively. And then as we've kind of heard reference, there's different levels of protection for CITES. So some animals can't be traded at all. Some animals, there's some really strict regulations on trading. So like ivory, there's a few legal sales that happen which are allowed by CITES. And then the lowest status will kind of just try to help countries sort of at their individual level. And this is for both living animals as well as parts of the animals. So when Corey shot that rhino, he had to go through CITES in order to bring the rhino carcass back. Most species-based conservation is going to happen in zoos. And really, the success depends on your species. Like some species are really great at reproducing, and other ones are just, they don't really care. Can be super expensive. We spend a lot of money on some of these species. We spend like $20,000 for every humpback chub that there is to try to protect them. Some zoos might have better or worse conditions, but there's also the public education that comes from it. Personally, I got a lot of kind of awareness and appreciation for animals by going to the zoo. But long term, we need some habitat protection. We already looked at the Svalbard seed bank, but another example of looking at the species-based level versus the habitat level. And we also talked about flagship species that are the nice charismatic ones, which might help get people to donate to organizations. And then ideally, if you protect a species with a big range, you might also protect other species that live in the same habitat. So if we try to protect the Florida panther in this case, you might also protect the other critters that live in the Everglades as well. The issue with flagship species is sometimes you might prioritize certain species over other ones. And then if the species goes extinct, well, that's a little bit awkward. If we actually run out of pandas and that's your logo, like, whoops. And we've talked quite a bit about keystone species too. Really useful to think about keystone species because you can save entire ecosystems instead of just an individual species. In this example, an alligator will dig out a gator hole, and then the gator hole provides habitat for the fish, and the fish provide food for the wading birds and raccoons, and so you have like all these compounding effects which occur just from one species. And then we'll finish with a few examples of habitat-based conservation. So this was all really heavily influenced by island biogeography, which is the study of where life, bio, is found on different islands. That's the geography part. So there's a really cool simulation that we'll just look at here because it's so fun. But basically what they found was that larger, well-connected islands have fewer extinctions, and smaller, more remote islands have more extinctions. So in this simulation, you can look at how, hey, what's going on? Oops, this one. You can look at how the distance from the mainland affects the number of species on an island. So this was originally studied like with real islands in the world, but you can imagine instead of islands in the ocean, these are national parks in the middle of development, right? And so that's the idea. If your park is closer to the wilderness, then maybe species will have an easier time getting to your park. If your park is further away, they'll have a harder time. The other thing they really looked at with island biogeography wasn't just location, let's just clear the islands, but also size. So they noticed that islands that are a lot smaller tend to support fewer species and also tend to have higher levels of extinction. As we saw, there were 2 species on there, but then one of them died out. Now there's 3. Let's see if the 3 can last. Oh, a 4th. Wow, oh, they're doing okay, actually. Nice. And it looks like we're back down to 3. Whereas this big island, right, still got a lot. And that seems pretty obvious, right? If we have more land, we'll probably conserve more species. So here's sort of like some on-the-ground lessons from island biogeography. So we have examples of worse reserves and better reserves. So it's better to conserve full ecosystems rather than partial ones. Larger ones are bigger. Fragmented ones are worse because, whoops, now you have a piece of city, say, to walk through. Having more reserves is obviously better. And then having some corridors can also help it. There's some really cool things like wildlife corridors that people build. Anyone seen a wildlife bridge before? Wildlife overpass. There's some in the West, actually.
What the heck?
So cool, right? Yeah, so basically you just build these overpass and then the animals will use that to cross the road. Pretty cool, right? Also putting like little stepping stones of habitat in between can be pretty helpful as well. Some more examples here. Having habitats that are really diverse can protect more species, right? Versus just having one type of ecosystem. Having an irregular shape creates a lot of edge effects. So this is like where you could have like invading of other ecosystems. So having a rounder shape will kind of protect the core, right? Having a mixture can be a little bit better, and then sort of thinking about them as a whole versus managing them individually In the Southwest, there's the 4 forest initiatives. So there's the Coconino National Forest and the Prescott National Forest and the Tonto National Forest and the Kaibab National Forest. And they all have an agreement to manage the Ponderosa Pine Forests, which don't care about the boundaries of the government. So they manage them all together to actually try to restore those forests. And then maybe, making some sort of buffer zone to affect humans. Here's some data from Africa. You can see the populations of small herbivores, large herbivores, and then large carnivores in different sized parks. So smaller parks over here, larger parks over here, and you can see as the park size increases, the population size also increases. Pretty cool. So the question ends up being, well, where do we decide to conserve? So one of my favorite things, my favorite tools is something called GIS spatial analysis. So what you do is you look at your species, in this case the caribou, and then you think about what types of features the caribou needs. What land requirements does it have? What types of water access does it need? Does it like to live in flat areas or steep areas? And you find all these layers, basically, like maybe caribou don't like to be near roads. So if there's a road, you get a worse value. And then it does a bunch of math, and then it makes a map, and then it'd be like red is really good habitat for caribou, and blue is really bad habitat for caribou. And then you can go find the caribou right there. Super cool, right? Yeah, here's sort of another example of how it happened. You would have vegetation types as one layer. You would have sightings of species, you might have your preserves, and then you can see how effective your preserves are at actually protecting the species you're looking for. I did analysis like this in college. We were looking at clapper rails, and we wanted to know if they preferred a certain habitat. So we had our observations of the clapper rails, and then we had our vegetation types, and then I overlaid both of those layers to make a map showing where the rails were and what the vegetation was. And then we found, hey, they live in mangroves, which again was something that is known through observation, but the more evidence you have to support that knowledge is very useful in science. So, cool. Any questions from you guys?